Welcome to the Gentleman's Guide to Gaming. This video is the third part to my Dark Ages Vampire Chronicle recap. The Chronicle is currently still ongoing. Now, before I continue with the recap, I just wanted to show you something that will hopefully show up well on camera. In the last session, Lord Amber of Bedford of Ventru had given Lady Cheyenne of Clan Torridor and of the Road of Sin a scroll, a manuscript, of a foreign origin that supposedly detailed an offshoot of the Road of Sin, a path of the adversary. And this essentially entailed me giving the player of Lady Cheyenne, Nikki, a piece of paper with some old Etruscan writing and Lord Amber's basic translations. Now, Nikki decided to go to work on this, and what she ended up with was an aged document. She decided to age it by scrunching it up repeatedly, tea staining it, coffee staining it, burning it around the edges, putting holes through it, and generally making it look quite good, if I've got to be honest. So she got bonus XP. And if there's one thing I can say for the group that I'm running for right now for Dark Ages Vampire, they are a group that puts an awful lot of investment in their characters, in the sense that I know what their motives are, I know what their aims, their ambitions are, and that's a really good thing for me, because my chronicles are largely based around the characters and their motivations more than any overarching theme or story. While there is one, it's the characters that drive it, and these players are being very accommodating in that fashion, very helpful to me, whether they know it or not. Now, the coterie had just arrived in Huntingdon, and Huntingdon, oddly, is devoid of menfolk, at least largely. There's women, there's children, there's cripples, and indeed there's nuns of the womenfolk in the convent atop the hill. But the inn is abandoned, it's locked up, and that is where the coterie decided to rest up during the day, before making a plan to go on ahead. Previously, Sylvanus Brents, our Cappadocian, had lost an arm to a lupine, and was urgently in need of either a rapid transfusion or infusion of blood, and, as he was surmising, an amputation. Or not an amputation from him, but from an unsuspecting victim. During the day, David, Lady Cheyenne's ghoul, had encountered one of the womenfolk of Huntingdon, and she had explained to him how a lot of the children have been possessed by demons, according to the nuns from the convent, and so they've had to be put down. And not only that, but with all the men gone, a lot of the women were starving. The rain has never stopped here, not for months, and historically, accurately, it did rain incredibly heavily during that year, resulting in mass starvation across the British Isles, simply because all of the crops were ruined, and we were constantly at war with other countries, and therefore trade across borders wasn't really something that was going on at that point. So Huntingdon is in a bad way. The women are starving, the children are starving, and people aren't happy at all. David, bringing the woman back to the inn to explain this, encountered Lord Hyle of Clan Sombra, who was just waking up for the night, who spotted the woman, grabbed her, and threw her down the stairs into the cellar beneath the inn. This broke her neck, and resulted in a feeding frenzy from the rest of the coterie. While Tobias had a little bit, Sylvanus had the most, but Sylvanus decided he would also amputate her right arm and attach it to his stump, through the great expenditure of vitae and a little bit of mortis, some willpower, and having to be staked due to his closeness to frenzy at times. But what it resulted in was a working, if effeminate, limb, which wasn't out of place with the rest of his body, to be honest, because the woman had been starving. He looks like a starved corpse, and so it goes. And from that point on, he decided, well, this should do the job. This should replace my lost limb. How wrong he was. In the meantime, Sylvanus and Hyle had decided that they needed to expand their entourage. The lupines they'd been in encounters with lupines not once but twice now, and it was becoming very apparent that during the day they were afforded very little protection, especially when they were out in the countryside. So they needed some mortal followers, they needed some retainers. But in a town with no menfolk, no men-at-arms to recruit, what were they to do? They went to planning. In the meantime, Tobias decided to head to the church, to say his prayers, to be closer to God, and so on. Tobias being a very much religious Nosferatu on the road of heaven. He had disguised himself as an attractive lady in order to attend church. The priest is gone, he noticed, and the church was largely abandoned. Well, was entirely abandoned, except for a woman who found him, disguised as her, within the church and questioned her as to her origins. This civilian of Huntingdon wanted to know where this healthy-looking woman was from, where she was going. Did she bring men with her? Did she bring food, resources? Tobias, through adequate acting and good questioning, discovered some of the reasons behind the lack of men in Huntingdon. For one thing, the men had moved to other lands and they couldn't afford to take their families with them. After all, peasants are, for all intents and purposes, slaves and need to find barons to own them. And so they were all looking for nearby regions, Wisbech, Charteris, St Ives, Bedford as well. They were looking for fields to till, lands to look after, animals to rear, in order to send food back to their families, or better, to be able to send for their families after finding a suitable lord to be beholden to. So that was one reason some of the men were gone. Another reason was that the local baron had taken his priests, and a lot of the able-bodied menfolk off on the crusades in the last few months. This resulted in Huntingdon being especially hard hit, and the town itself being left in the care of the nuns in the convent, which was a very odd state of affairs. Women very rarely had such positions of command in the British Isles around this time. So Tobias had discovered some information. In the meantime, Lady Cheyenne had made her way up to the convent, where she found men tilling the ground. These men rather pudgy of face, round of shape, a bit thick around the neck and cheek. But most of them fairly muscular. They were quite scared of her. They backed away from her as she approached, this well-to-do looking woman, beautiful even, and some of the nuns came out to greet her. Despite the lateness of the hour, they wanted to know who she was, where she came from, etc., etc. She explained that she was a passing traveller, had lost her entourage, and she was looking for some sanctuary during the night, and the nuns would not allow their menfolk to enter, but they did allow Lady Cheyenne. Upon introduction to the Mother Superior, and the convent, by the way, is, although prior to Gothic, an immensely Gothic structure, an old fort comprised primarily of stone, a hard castle, for all intents and purposes, decked out with all of the finery you would expect within a baron's keep, rather than the Spartan nature of a convent. Still tapestries hung on the wall, it was warm inside, there was food there, none of the nuns looked ill or underfed. In fact, the nuns seemed remarkably healthy and happy compared to the people down in the main body of Huntingdon. The Mother Superior, a ruddy woman about as wide as she is tall, explained some of what was going on to Lady Cheyenne, but also went on to explain that these men in their service were all of the convicts and all of the cripples and any of the men that had been left behind. They said that they can work the relatively healthy lands outside of the convent, providing they were willing to succumb to castration. The nuns feared the men. They did not want the men roving around whilst there were no other men to protect the main body of the town, no militia. And so they gave the option: castration and sanctuary, food, etc., or stay in the dungeons. And as there's no one to keep you in the dungeons, starve to death. There's no one to feed you, no one to clean you, no one to look after you. And so, perhaps unsurprisingly, the majority of men decided to take her up on her offer, and so they joined the convent as these castrati, these eunuch land tillers. Lady Cheyenne wasn't horrified necessarily, but she was quite intrigued by this, and agreed to go along to midnight mass with the nuns. The Mother Superior, interestingly, was handling the mass. While a priest would usually be called in for such a thing, it was actually the nuns responsible for all services, and so this was an interesting town in this respect. The nuns had very much taken the reins of power and were seeing all of what was going on as God's blessing, that those who were faithful were being fed, they were being cared for, they were being kept warm and healthy. Those who were not were staying down in the town, being left to be destitute. But by all means, if they turned themselves over to the convent and became brides of Christ, they would be cared for. The Mother Superior, as a point of interest, is the second sister of a greater lord to the north, who the coterie may well encounter at some point. As was often the case with nuns, they weren't often poor people who went into the convents and rose up the ladder of ecumenicality, but I think I made that word up. But rather, they were the second daughters or third daughters of nobles, and it was a good way for a noble family to get in with the church and have the church pay them a stipend. And so this was the similar case in Huntingdon with the Mother Superior. Lord Hyle and Sylvanus had come up with their plan. Around this time, Tobias had elected, was under the guise of a very handsome priest, who had all of a sudden showed up, to rest in the cells that were being shared with all the convicts and cripples and, well, castrati. Lady Cheyenne had asked for a tour around the convent and was at the same time being shown these cells and identified Tobias through various coded signals. So they were in the cells at the same place at the same time. At this point, Lord Hyle and Lord Sylvanus, the Seneschal Sylvanus, also showed up with an amphora, I suppose, or a jug or a keg. I think it changed in the telling each time, of an anticoagulated concoction. Sylvanus had been out doing his apothecary thing, cutting off roots and looking for the bark of the willow tree and so on, to make an anticoagulant. And using this anticoagulant, Lord Hyle eked some blood from his veins into this amphora, mixed it with some of the wine from in the cellar. And this was as a means to perform a mass blood bond on the nuns in the convent. Lord Hyle and Lord Sylvanus, I keep calling him Lord Sylvanus, maybe one day, had decided that if they could not have men-at-arms, they would have battle nuns to protect them. They would have an entourage of nuns to go around with them during the day, and to also perhaps defend them during the night, and ultimately ghoul them. And as they did not have enough blood between them and their bodies to actually blood bond all of them, they decided to water the blood down. Now, the mechanics for doing this are somewhat shaky, but I gave them some basic rules on how many nuns they could conceivably blood bond and how much blood it would actually take. So they decided the nuns they didn't like, they would just feed from constantly, and they would become something of a siphon for this blood to go through them, turn into vitae over time, and then make more of this magic potion that would blood bond the nuns. They arrived also with Sylvanus in the guise of a priest, not knowing that Tobias had done the same thing. And so the nuns became suitably leery around this point. They were starting to doubt the good intentions of the coterie. They basically stated that Lord Hyle and Sylvanus could also spend the night in the cells, but they would have to perform service during the morning. This made them somewhat reticent, shall we say. So, what ended up happening was Lord Hyle decided to sate his thirst on one of the nuns, a pinch-faced, waspish old crone of a nun, who he cruelly mistreated, fed from, threw across the cell, and then, with his increased dominate, he'd been using his experience wisely, he erased her memory and put something else in her mind, that she had come on to him, that she had succumbed to her lust, and he threw her out. That's why he had beaten her so. Tobias, in the guise of the handsome priest, was doing a similar thing, but with a young and attractive nun by the name of Assumpta, who was proceeding to undress him. He was proceeding to undress her. It was becoming quite romantic, it was becoming quite lusty, and it was becoming very unbecoming for a member of the Road of Heaven. And yet Tobias, who had never experienced any of these bodily pleasures before, and perhaps the nun as well, were finding themselves inextricably drawn to one another for some reason. Perhaps it was because Tobias, with his outrageously successful obfuscate, had ended up making a priest with an appearance of 5. Who knows? But what could have happened, and I won't go into in great detail, would have resulted in the Nosferatu feeding this nun blood in a way that you traditionally do not. There you go. That's a nice and cautious way of approaching it. What actually happened was Tobias had kissed her, fed from her lip, and they didn't actually consummate their passion, but she left and vowed to return during the day. It was around this point that the coterie decided to hot-foot it back to the inn because they realised they couldn't be summoned during the day. If they did, that would result in a very short chronicle. Lady Cheyenne at this point had left the convent and headed to the Baron's Keep, which had also been abandoned, even out of men-at-arms, no militia to guard it. And she entered the keep, found that it appeared to be inhabited by a Cainite, no less. The Cainite was not there, but she was fairly certain that this Cainite was one Claudius San Giovanni, who had been cited as being in the area by Lord Amber. She returned to the inn as well and informed Sylvanus Brents of this fact. The reason she came to the conclusion that the Cainite had been there, before I forget, was that when she scaled the wall to get back out of the keep, she found that her servant David had been almost drained entirely of his blood. So it wasn't terribly subtle that Claudius San Giovanni was there. She had basically left a message: get away from the place that I'm making my haven currently. The following night, Sylvanus Brents had decided that he would confront Claudia San Giovanni. He wanted to meet her, he wanted to meet a fellow member of his clan. And so, he went back to the keep, and did indeed get confronted by her wielding a crossbow and threatening him with a bolt clean through the heart. He wanted to know her intentions, she wanted to know his. She explained that she, laughable as it sounds, had been sent by the greater body of the clan to investigate the old magician Merlin. Yes, I know, it sounds ridiculous. And that she was specifically seeking the burial place of the ancient King Arthur and his bride Guinevere. Because supposedly, if she could find Excalibur, which had been partly created by Merlin, supposedly, then she would also be able to track down this Merlin and unlock great secrets of magical power. How much of this was screed and, nonsense, even she didn't believe what she was doing, but it was by the great command of her clan, and so she had been sent to search the British Isles. She'd already searched northern Germany for this kind of thing, and was now searching the British Isles, and going round and round in circles trying to find something that may or may not exist. Sylvanus gave her some information, but wasn't so loose with the tongue as to explain that they were acting as mediator between Tremere and Salubri. However, with his new limb already starting to atrophy, Claudius San Giovanni did give him the sage advice that what he needs is either a Tremere, in order to work some blood magic to make that limb stick, or a Salubri to act some healing magic to make that limb stick. And so, once again, the coterie are divided between which clan is more useful to have around. She also explained something about the road ahead, that the river would be the safest path on, and that, let's see, Ely is occasionally the home to an Elysium of mages, werewolves and vampires once a year. That the vampire lord of Ely has recently gone into torpor, leading to a state of semi-civil war between the rest of the Cainites there. That there's a strong presence of true faith in Ely, due to the Archbishop, or rather Bishop William Longchamp, the regent to the crown of the British Isles at this point, dwelling in the cathedral there. That Bishop's Lynn, also en route, is almost entirely infested with lupines. No vampires at all make their haven there, and they run the town in a very similar way to how a vampire would. They actually have a court, they have a prince, and it's a very strange state of affairs indeed. She gave him advice that if he was to stay in Ely, the safest place is a church on the bridge in that town. So, they had had their meeting. They vowed to keep correspondence. She told him where she was going. He vaguely said where he was going, and then they parted. Meanwhile, Lord Hyle had decided that he would return to the convent on the following night to proceed with his blood bonding trick, and the Mother Superior was fast to cast him out. She could sense there was something amiss with him, and he, in similar fashion, could sense there was something amiss with her. When he attempted to dominate her, and it didn't work. Her willpower was dramatically high. She didn't believe the claims of the nun that was saying, "I forced myself upon Lord Hyle," despite the fact her memory said so. She realised there was some kind of bewitchment. However, this Mother Superior wasn't radiating true faith, but something wholly odd, and Lady Cheyenne was able to sense this, as was, in fact, even those without Auspex, with their dramatically high perception checks, were able to sense that there was something inhabiting the body of the Mother Superior, or some things inhabiting the bodies of the Mother Superior. The young nun, by the way, who had almost consummated her passion with Tobias, had been bricked up during the day, and Tobias had gone to free her, having kind of fallen in love with her, although also wanting to offer her a way out. He smashed through the brick wall and saved this young nun, and sort of whisked her off with him. At the same time, Lady Cheyenne was attempting to recruit men from the cells for their, well, half men from the cells for their entourage, and they managed to get one guy, Tom the Goat, because he bleats and he's also a rapist. He's in the employ of Sylvanus Brents by this point. William and John the Roach, and two twin brothers, one of whom is simpler than the other, but another one is skilled at horse husbandry, animal husbandry. And they've also managed to secure Eric the Boatman, who is a boatman. They now have a simple entourage of men, but Lord Hyle wanted an entourage of women. He wanted his battle nuns, and so he came back at the nun, the Mother Superior. He could see that what was inside her was a conflicting, raging mass of spectres, or spirits, angry spirits, that at some point or other, whether recently, whether a long time ago, had possessed her and were driving her, and that these spirits were communing with further spirits that were within the walls of this convent. This convent was absolutely filled, festooned with spectres. This building was unholy in the extreme, was the kind of thing that would exist strongly on both sides of the gauntlet. In the Shadowlands, it would probably look like some great demonic castle with spires that dripped blood. For all of the children that had been sacrificed from Huntingdon were being bricked up in this place. Women were being bricked up in this place. And the reason the children were being executed in the first place was never actually discovered, so I won't actually go into it, just in case the coterie ever do return to Huntingdon. Lord Hyle had charged into the Mother Superior's chambers after she somehow dominated him, puppeteered him into basically, get the fuck out of my convent. He overcame this domination as he got to the door, the threshold, drew his broadsword and charged within, and with exemplary use of potence, cut her from neck to waist, to hip, quite swiftly. The raging spectres that poured out basically scoured him with this acidic ectoplasm, burned him, forced their way inside him, looking for a new host, and the closest one being this La Sombra. And now Lord Hyle is the host to various very angry spirits that want to take control of him. He grabbed the nuns that he could, and they set ablaze to the rest of the convent. Or, no, in fact, they didn't even set ablaze. Lord Hyle decided to go on a impassioned massacre. No, not even impassioned. Cold, calculated massacre of all of the nuns that he didn't want. He did not want any witnesses, he did not wish for any survivors. And the scary thing was Lord Hyle at no point lost control during any of this. He never frenzied. He never lost sight of what he was doing. He was, with deliberate measure, going around to every cell with every nun, and he was executing every single one that he didn't want. And he wasn't drinking from them, he was just killing them. And, what's more, he somehow justified this. He lost a point of his road, admittedly, but he was somehow able to justify this in his mind, due to some rather good rolls, admittedly, but it showed a cold and very dark side to Lord Hyle, because while no doubt many of the nuns in the convent were corrupt, to say all of them were maybe a bit of an overstatement. And so they'd seized 6 nuns, including the young Assumpta, who had taken her pre-nun name, Catherine, now that she was in the employ of Tobias, and courting him, in a sense, as he hadn't dropped his obfuscation, or had regained it. The other nuns, who I do have the names of, most of which contain the words Peter or Marie, or Mary, are now shanghaied, bloodbound to some extent, absolutely fear-addled, along with their male servants. The only ones who are really coming willingly at this point are Catherine, because she was saved by Tobias, Thomas the Goat, who is a monster, a rapist, a horrible, horrible human being, but perfectly matched with Sylvanus, really. Not a rapist in the way you might imagine a rapist, because, again, he's been castrated, but that doesn't stop Tom. If he wants to do it, he will. So he's willingly going along. David, of course, the Gaunt Lady Cheyenne. And the others, Eric the Boatman, the nuns, William and John, are utterly petrified, utterly frightened to death of these Cainites. Will they make good servants in so being? It's now 3 days and nights' journey to go straight through St. Ives to Ely, which is the next place they wish to go. They left Huntingdon, a town where a convent of nuns have been butchered. Will that come back to haunt them? Not to mention the haunts that are possessing Hyle at this point, or at least within his body and mind and soul. What will Tobias do when he finally has to drop his masquerade and show his real face to Catherine? All of this and more will be discovered, especially, not to mention, Sylvanus' arm has dropped off once again, so clearly that didn't work. Clearly, when the werewolves cut through him, they had coated their claws in something that would prevent the wound from healing. But what? And how? And will Sylvanus ever be able to get that arm back? We shall find out in the next exciting part of Dark Ages Vampire. And as usual, if you have any suggestions for this chronicle as they make their way up to the Salubri of Lindisfarne, please do come up with suggestions. Also, before I forget, we know of which Cainites dwell in Ely. We know that there is Daniel the Magister, La Sombra, who is also by blood the brother of Lord Hyle. They share the same sire. We know that there is Aetheldred the Ventru, quite old, who has recently gone into torpor, and his child, Alice Upland. The two, the La Sombra and the Ventru, vie for control of Ely. In the middle of it all, a Salubri by the name of Bethany, who is somehow able to be protected here from the Tremere incursions, no doubt due to the true faith, but belongs to an order that is not well liked, and if anything it puts an even bigger target on this Salubri's head. So, what will happen? We will have to see. Thank you very much for watching.